Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the IPHA political series. This is a series of conversations where we invite one of our affiliate member companies to have a conversation with an elected representative, TDs, who are prominent in the area of health policy and indeed policy relating to medicines. And this morning, we're delighted to have Deputy Padrig OSullivan from Fianna Fáil, who is sponsoring an amendment bill to the Health Act, as we call it, the Health Act 2013, the Pricing and Supply of Medical Goods Amendment Bill 2021, which he introduced in October last. Padrig is from Cork North Central. We'll go into more details of his political career and so on in this conversation with Blaine Gaffney. Blaine is from Edelman Global Advisors. He has experience in politics, both in the National Parliament and in the European Parliament, where he worked alongside our current, so now Commissioner Maureen McGuinness. And he came straight from the Dáil, indeed, into Edelman only in the course of the last year. So Blaine is highly tuned in to politics, both in Ireland and in Europe. And as you know, with these fireside conversations, we have no fire, but we have plenty of warmth and detail and interesting stuff to listen to. We do ask all our members and affiliates to respect the fact that our both participants in the conversation have agreed to do this on the basis that it is kept confidential. It's Chatham House rules. We have no way of enforcing that except to ask for you to respect that, and we hope that indeed everyone will do so. So with that, I'll hand it over to Blaine, and thanking very much both Deputy OSullivan and Blaine for doing this with us. And we hope, and I'm pretty sure it'll be a very interesting conversation coming up. As I think has been the case before, questions can be asked in the Q&A forum. They will be available to be seen by Blaine, who will come to them at the later part of the conversation. So over to you, Blaine, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Oliver, for the introduction. It's great to be here with you all this morning, and kind of commence this event here this morning by welcoming all the people who are tuning in from across Ireland, from home or from work. We've just heard that our guest is Deputy Padrig OSullivan, who, as we all know, has published private members' legislation in 2001 on the issue of improving the availability of orphan drugs for rare diseases in Ireland. So with that, we're going to have a relaxed discussion. We're going to have a couple of icebreakers. We're going to get into, I suppose, some of the issues around the legislation, and then we'll look at some questions and answers from you, the guests, and we'll finish up just before 9 o'clock. So, Padrig, can you tell us a bit about yourself, where you're from, about your family background, and a little bit about what you did before entering politics?
Yeah, so I'm 38 next month. I'm a school teacher by trade, married to Bernie Healy, a medical scientist actually in CUH, father of 3 children, 3-year-old, 2-year-old, and an 8-month-old. And I suppose I'm, just involved in my community for many, many years. I grew up in Little Island, actually, which many of your listeners might be familiar with. It's one of the largest employment hubs actually in the country, and home to many pharmaceutical companies as well. So I'm not going to say that that's necessarily where I got my interest in this topic, but it definitely probably helped insofar as so many business companies like that were on my doorstep. But school teacher, Irish and history, and just kind of got into politics from a community perspective.
Okay, thanks for that. I suppose you mentioned there that you have a young family, a very young family. It must be difficult, I suppose, to try and balance the busy work-life element of politics versus the home life. Are you able to be at home more now than before? I suppose with recent Dáil changes to voting times and things, or is it still as heavy as it ever was?
Look, politics, and trust me, no politician ever looks for sympathy, but politics is a fairly hot and heavy career path to choose. And look, during COVID, I suppose, like many people, you had the opportunity to work from home a bit more. You had the opportunity, I suppose, not to have to attend as many public functions. And to be fair, I got that extra time at home to spend with a young family. But typically, politics, it's one of those things where you get, you could spend every hour of every day at it, 7 days a week, and whether it's the politicians attending funerals or whatever the stereotypical view of us might be from time to time. There's always something to be at, whether it's a public event, whether it's a community council meeting, sporting AGM, whatever the case may be. Your time, you never have enough time for everything, but you try and make bits and pieces available to the family, particularly at the weekends, and I kind of try and keep the Sunday just for family as best I can.
Yeah, I can imagine it's very difficult being in Dublin and having the young family. So, I think the importance of people seeing that and the sacrifice that politicians give up is very, very important. You mentioned that you were a teacher, and I think it's an interesting development in Ireland that we tend to elect so many teachers to the Oireachtas every election. I think in the current Dáil, there's 19 of the 160 TDs are former teachers. Why do you think that is? Why are teachers so electable in Ireland?
Yeah, I'm not sure there's as many teachers as there might have been, years ago. But at the same time, I do believe that, teachers are kind of embedded in their own local communities a lot of the time. Whether, as I said, I would have been involved in a soccer club, heavily involved in a GA club, community organisation, heritage group, tidy towns, you name it. Not just as a politician, even before my time in politics. And I think teachers kind of are similar. They're probably training the school team, and then that probably spills over to the local community where they're training, the local sports team as well. And I just think that, particularly in my case, I worked and lived in the same town, Glenmire, just outside Cork City, and I suppose you almost become synonymous with the locality or the suburb in my case. And I think that it definitely helps in politics the more people you know, and I think that's just part and parcel of it.
Definitely, yeah, definitely. It's definitely interesting. Okay, so before you became a teacher and before you became a politician, what was the best job you ever had, and what was the worst job you ever had?
I'll start with the worst job because it's probably apt for today's conversation. I worked in a pharmaceutical company. It's probably not fair for me to name them. And I worked for the first time in my life 12-hour shifts and two night shifts back to back. And I did that for about 6 months while I was a student, and it really took its toll on me. I definitely found out that I wasn't a night owl. The best job I ever had, believe it or not, other than teaching, because I love that career and it suited me. But I actually enjoyed working in Dunn stores, believe it or not. Just got to know a lot of people from working on the shop floor as a student, and I think it's probably helped shape me, and prepared me for politics. So it's something that I will always take with me.
Well done. I suppose just to give our audience a little bit of last insight into who you are, before we get into your legislation, I suppose your political path towards the Dáil. I've got a couple of short would you rather questions, so I'm going to fire these very quickly at you. Would you rather hurling or football?
Oh, East Cork hurling, yeah.
Guinness or Murphy's?
Murphy's.
Morning or night time?
Probably night time.
Aer Lingus or Ryanair?
Yeah, Aer Lingus.
Would you travel back in time or go forward to the future?
History teacher, so back in time.
Marty Whelan or Marty Morrissey?
I suppose Marty Morrissey.
And would you prefer Dublin or Kerry to win, Sam?
It's like in soccer, anything but Man United, anything but Dublin, unfortunately, still. So
very good. Thanks for that. So I suppose looking at the path, your path in politics, you've been a very successful politician. You joined the Fianna Fáil party in 2012. You went on to successfully contest the local election, a by-election, and then a general election for the party. What was the key reason to join? What was the key reason that made you join a political party and then put your name on a ballot paper?
I suppose, I came from a background where none of my family had any political involvement, to be fair, and weren't affiliated to any party. But I suppose, look, we did at home have the tendency to either vote for Fianna Fáil or vote Labour, and that was just, kind of established within our own household. But I suppose I joined Fianna Fáil initially, actually in 2007, 2008, as an ordinary member, and it probably wasn't the most popular time to join Fianna Fáil, whatever about any other political party. But I suppose for myself, growing up in a working class estate, Fianna Fáil always had that tradition of representing working class people and prioritising education. And I obviously became a teacher, and I suppose, providing for social mobility. And I think those were the key determinants as to why I joined politics and then subsequently Fianna Fáil. So yeah, it's strange.
Yeah, I see. Not everybody has the opportunity to go and win a by-election. That must have been some achievement.
Yeah, well, politics is funny. People always ask me like, how do you make a success of it? Like I did contest 3 elections, I think, in the space of 18 months. It was quite busy, and my wife wasn't a big fan of mine during that period. But I suppose even your question, you said, how do you make a success of it? I suppose if politics or the political success is determined by winning elections, then yeah, I've been reasonably successful. But I would think now that I'm here, I want to make the most of my time. I want to see legislation progress. I actually am working on 3 bills, including the one we're going to talk about later. I'm not here just to sit and make up the numbers and push the buttons on a Wednesday night to vote. And I see my role beyond that. And I want to contribute as I hope to do in this bill.
Yeah, I think there's definitely a very independent streak in you that you've been so successful at a local level, at a by-election level, and then at a general election level. And I suppose you seem to be a TD who is keen on getting things done, and that can be seen obviously by your record. But also now you're saying that you have another number of bills on the way. And is this a form of new politics? You're a relatively young politician. You want to get things done. You're active. I would ask: is technology big in, or even social media? Are these big aspects of your political political machine, or are you tend to be more traditional in your approach to politics?
It's a bit of both for me. I'm not the greatest at social media and technology, but I would have been, I suppose, prepared for my political life. I would have been a supporter and a councillor under Billy Kelleher, and I suppose the tradition that I was brought up on under working with his office was essentially to do the constituency work, the hard graft, the knocking on doors, doing the day-to-day stuff. I hate to say the pothole politics, but a lot of it was that. Billy obviously was a politician with a national profile, and spent 20 odd years up here. So there's a lot more to it than that, but I suppose that's the bread and butter, and everything else you can try and develop yourself afterwards. But I think politics has changed, particularly in the last few years, in that so far as people like me that are relatively new to it realize that the lifespan that politicians maybe had in the past isn't probably what it's going to be into the future. And I think there is a mentality that make the most of it while you're here, and that's definitely the mentality I have.
Yeah. I suppose when I kind of get it down to the question about the social media element of it, it's everywhere now in politics. Somebody I worked with previously was more traditional, and when he could see the value of social media, he really grew into it. But there's a lot of positives with social media, but there's also a lot of negatives with social media. How does it affect you in your work?
Yeah, I suppose there's some evenings I just turn it off, if I'm blunt and straight. And I'm relatively anonymous insofar as I'm a backbencher. I'm not a minister. I don't have some of the issues that some of the senior ministers have had to deal with, thankfully. And there's various security threats, and I know we'll speak about Minister Donnelly later, but he's a case in point insofar as he had to erect fencing outside his house, to deter people from protesting outside there. That type of I don't want to call it scrutiny, I'll call it harassment. Look, it's there. It's a part of modern politics, and it's unfortunate. I'd gladly stand over anybody's right to protest and to voice their opposition to something. But when it comes to somebody's home in particular, I think it's different. And I suppose social media gives that opportunity to people to beam into every politician's home over a phone or over a laptop. So
who knows? We just learned this week that Elon Musk has purchased Twitter. He may be seeking to bring in changes to combat some of the anonymity that goes on, which knows an awful lot to do with the abuse that is out there for politicians. But no, I just thought it was interesting to get a feel for whether you're a more traditional approach, or if you would have been, I suppose, relying heavily on social media for your connection with your constituents. You mentioned there Billy Kelleher. You would have come up in around his operation. He's now an MEP. Do you still keep in touch?
Yeah, I suppose I was very lucky in politics. Look, timing and luck is everything in politics. And, you know, when Billy decided to run for Europe, I suppose that was my opportunity to stake a claim and run instead of him and seek the nomination. But we'd speak on a weekly basis. You know, a lot of it is, you know, it's a new scene for him. He's over in the Parliament now in Europe, and I suppose it's different from the cut and thrust of day-to-day national politics. And I think initially there was a bit of him that missed maybe the you know the Dáil and, you know, the day-to-day stuff. But I think he's definitely done a good job at EU level, and I suppose even the topic we're going to discuss later today is also prominent at EU level, and there's going to be big changes there, hopefully. I know that he's involved in that with, to be fair, Francis Fitzgerald as well. So, you know.
Yeah, and that's the reason I kind of just name dropped him, given the fact that he is such a, I suppose, well-known MEP, and I suppose the pan-European debate that's underway currently, which we'll touch on later, your connections there into that, and indeed your own efforts here in Ireland, they're quite relevant to our listeners today. One last question with regards, I suppose, to your personal background and you know, your role as your TD, or as a TD before we move into the legislation. I suppose since being elected, you know, to the Dáil, do you think, you know, your experience with the Dáil, has it been everything that you thought it would be as you were somebody who entered politics, who thought they were going to be able to make changes? I suppose you got into politics for the reasons why you did. Has it been everything that you thought it would be?
I think any politician that would suggest to you that they're fully happy is probably lying to you. We're never happy. It can be quite frustrating at times, particularly, look, I'm a backbencher. I'm trying to put forward my own legislation. I'm not a minister. I'm not a junior minister. I'm not a cabinet. I don't have that level of influence or input. But that said, you know, in the likes of Michael McGrath, Darragh O'Brien, you know, I have access to senior ministers that I know listen to me. And to be fair, the Taoiseach as well himself. And I suppose I'm leaning on that type of access and influence at the moment. And look, as a backbencher, definitely there's limitations there, and there's only so much you can do. But, you know, in a way, we have access to these guys, and we have to make the most of it and try and influence them as best we can. And, you know, I'll do my best in terms of this bill to make sure that, you know, in the lifetime of this government, that it'll get a fair hearing at the very least, whatever about its progression.
Okay, so I suppose with that, we'll move just briefly into legislation. It's titled the Health Pricing and Supply of Medical Goods Amendment Bill 2021. Where did the inspiration come, I suppose, to take the big leap? Because let's call it a spade, it is quite a big leap for a government backbench member to put down private members' legislation. It's not a route that's common, but it's a route that is often seen as being, you know, a pathway to success if people buy into it. So I suppose where did the inspiration come to put down this private members' legislation?
I suppose it's twofold, and I suppose initially I should acknowledge the work of John Brazel, you know, a former colleague of mine from Kerry. And to be fair, this bill is literally a copy paste of John's work, and he put an awful lot of time and effort into it. And rather than, you know, when the Dáil fell, rather than leave this go to waste, I said that I would take up the baton and I would try and, you know, bring it forward. Because unfortunately, John was in a position where the Dáil fell and John didn't get re-elected. So, you know, the legislation was going to fall away. So I brought it forward, to be fair, with the encouragement of the Taoiseach and the Minister for Health. And the point of bringing it back to first stage and not just, I suppose, kicking it again from third stage was, you know, it's important that we have the debate. And I think that, as you mentioned, particularly for private members bill, in my mind, you know, this bill might, you know, over time, you know, be amended, be altered in many different ways, but there is literally universal support for it in government and opposition. So I'm hopeful for it. I'm hopeful for its prospects. It's just about getting it on the agenda and getting it progressed.
Yeah, I come back just briefly just to the inspiration around. I mean, anybody who's worked in politics and political offices and with TDs and as TDs, you know, they know when an issue arises about patients, particular family in a constituency, or a particular group of patients who can't get access to, you know, really, really advanced medicine that can save either a family member's life or their own life, it gets quite personal in a constituency. I know that from my own example. I mean, was there any examples in your own constituency of I suppose, people who couldn't access orphan drugs, and did that have an inspiration in your endeavors?
Yeah, I suppose I came into this sphere. I was working on progressing the approval of a drug called patisiran for sufferers of amyloidosis. And that was my first taste of, I suppose, orphan drugs and rare diseases. And I personally knew a number of family members, not related to myself now, but in my constituency, who were affected by this. And I suppose in my numerous dial contributions on this topic, I would have spoken how that one of the hardest things I've had to do politically in my lifetime so far was to sit around that kitchen table, have a cup of tea with these families, and to be told by them that unless they get access to this drug, which they knew worked because it's available in other jurisdictions and it's effective, it's just we're so far behind in delivering these drugs. They found it very frustrating, as did I, seeking its approval for reimbursement. And I knew that, and they knew that, this drug could materially alter their life for the better. They were some of the most difficult conversations I've had in my brief political career, and I suppose that's the motivation. Since then, that drug has been approved, thankfully. But since then, I've been contacted by numerous other patients, suffering from different diseases that need access to our drugs also. So that's the motivation.
Yeah, I definitely found that particular aspect of working in politics the most difficult. Trying to campaign for families who are really in dire straits about getting access to medication. And I just, the role from a politician, from what I could see, shouldn't really be involved in this particular type of battle. And I just found it very personal, and it is something that you do take home with you. And I think you've alluded to it there, your own personal. You knew that family, and I suppose it's quite difficult. And every politician across the country has the same situation in their office, because it's an issue that's rising with different drugs in different constituencies. So I think that's the personal element of a politician getting immersed in this particular type of debate. It's quite a difficult moment. Bring it back then to your legislation. You would have picked this up when it was just about to go into committee stage, and you took the decision to bring it back to the first stage. Can you explain just a little bit more about the rationale behind that? Because I suppose looking at it, you could nearly say, well, to just bring the bill back to the start. But you think it was more beneficial to the overall goal of achieving this aim by bringing it back to the first stage. What was the thinking behind that?
I suppose there's probably a few different answers to that, but and you've worked, Blaine, yourself in the political sphere, so you'd have an understanding, but I suppose not all bills, see the full light of day and fully progress through the Dáil. And I think debate is just as important as anything. And in this case, I'm hopeful and I'm optimistic about the prospects of this bill in some form, shape or form into the future. But I suppose the debate is just as important. And, I think particularly in this kind of sphere, personal stories, patient stories, quality of life that some of them have, I think those stories need to be heard, over and over again. And I think the more we hear these stories, the more we engage with these patient groups in particular, I think, more of a realization that something needs to be done here, because up till now, Ireland has been a laggard in this, and, we're way behind our European counterparts.
Yeah, well, just on that, I suppose, I was reading the report this morning from IPHA, 870 days from EMA market authorization to the time when it's available for patients in Ireland. And that's according to the latest annual patient weight indicator survey. The European average is 636. Why is this the case, do you believe? And why is Ireland so different than all its other EU member states?
I suppose the simple truth is the HSE, the Department of Health, is obsessed with getting bang for its buck, sometimes negotiating the price of drugs and prevaricating over whether to sanction something or not to death, really. That's the straight, honest answer. We seem obsessed with this idea that the harder the deal we drive, the better value it will be for the taxpayer. And sometimes, look, and I'm not, saying it just for the sake of it, and it's easy to say it and populist to say it, but, time in this case does cost lives, and it does cost people, quality of life. And And there are other systems right across the continent that do it differently and that do it better. And I don't understand why we can't, take best practice from the continent and do some of it here and implement it here. We can quote numerous examples: Sweden, Scotland, Czech Republic, countries that are of similar population demographic makeup, and it works in other jurisdictions. But here, as I said, just seem obsessed with getting bang for the buck, and that's not always what's best for the patient.
No. And I suppose just when you mentioned other countries there, and we were discussing the actual bill, I suppose one of the most prominent aspects of the bill is that it sets out to define the term orphan medicinal product in legislation. It's not in the current legislation, if I'm correct. So can you elaborate on that? And is this an attempt to follow best practice in other EU jurisdictions in terms of the legislative aspect?
Yeah, so look, you're right. In this country, we assess all drugs under the same process, essentially. And, like many of your listeners will be aware, they're working in industry. There are, orphan disease, rare diseases, orphan drugs, ultra orphan, that affect literally, a handful of people in this country. If anybody in this country, some of them are so rare. And to assess those drugs under the same category or under the same process as we do with every other drug, it's just it's mind-boggling. Specifically, there should be a designated pathway for orphan drugs and for sufferers of rare diseases, that they will be assessed, in a reasonably timely manner, in a streamlined process. Other countries can do it, in a couple of 100 days. As you referenced earlier, we range from anywhere north of 600 to 700 days up to 1,200, depending on the drug, depending on the outlier that you want to reference. And that process is undoubtedly not working. It's not delivering best health returns for patients. It's definitely not, humane. When you hide behind all the money and all the negotiation and whatever else the case may be, it's just not it's just not humane, and it's not the way to work the process.
Yeah, and I suppose let's just go back briefly just to the question. I know Minister Stephen Donnelly allocated additional funding for reimbursement for drugs over the last two budgets. I mean, that has to be a positive, but we still have the long wait. So would that indicate to you that, okay, whilst funding is always an issue in health, there's always a need for more funding, but that necessarily the problem mightn't be funding, it might be the processes that are currently in place. And really that's what needs to change, and that's where the focus can come, and that there could be other things that could be done outside of legislation that could help move this debate along.
Well, to be fair to Minister Donnelly, as you said, like 80 million has been provided over the last 2 years, and that's more money than has ever been provided for orphan drugs and this sphere that we're talking about this morning. That said, my legislation actually doesn't cost the state an additional cent. It's clear as day inside the bill that all this legislation needs to be implemented within budgetary constraints, and that's quite specifically identified inside there, because critics of this bill in the past and currently would suggest that this could potentially open the floodgates, break the bank, whatever description you want to put in it, and that's just a red herring. It's just a misnomer. This bill is all about streamlining the process, saving time, getting patients access to drugs in a timely manner. I suppose being more proactive with industry as well, to be fair, in terms of risk sharing, and like as you mentioned, there's an awful lot of non-legislative stuff that the minister could do aside from this bill. And if this bill never did see the light of day, I would have stressed to the minister over numerous occasions, and even last night at our parliamentary party meeting, I took the opportunity again to raise the issue of the Mazars report, which is yet to be published, despite, I suppose, being prepared since January 2020 and commenced a few years before that. And I would love to see that report for myself. I'm sure people on the call in industry would love to see it, because I would imagine the fact that it hasn't been published now up to this point would suggest that there's probably some damning stuff contained in that report, and an awful lot of the stuff that I'm pushing for in terms of the change to the reimbursement process and the timescales, a lot of it could probably be addressed on the recommendations contained in that report. And as I said, I'd just love to see it published.
Yeah, we're aware of that particular report, and I suppose all you can do is keep the pressure on to try and have that report published. In terms looking again back at your bill in terms of success. 2 or 3 years down the line, maybe a year down the line, I'm not sure. Legislation is funny, sometimes it can go very quickly all of a sudden and then come to a shuddering stop. But what does success look like for this bill? It's at the committee stage now. Have you got an agreement that it's going to be taken? Is it something that you're going to progress even without the support of the Department of Health? Or is it something that you could maybe see being morphed into government legislation in the coming months if you do get it to committee stage?
I suppose, funny enough, I was approached by officials in the Department of Health not so long ago, asking if I would withdraw the bill on the basis of a number of commitments that were given to me by the Minister's office, and I categorically said, not a hope in hell. And the reason for that rationale is, it's important to keep up the ante and keep up the pressure, and keep the debate going. As I said, there's an awful lot of things that the Minister can do, that the Department of Health can do, which don't require legislation. I've spoken about the Mazars report there. A successor to the National Rare Disease Plan is another issue that I think needs to be resolved. So there's a number of things that the Minister could do. And I think better engagement with industry and more transparency around the selection process, more interaction and better communication with patients groups in particular, because they feel totally out of the loop in terms of the process as it currently happens. So there's an awful lot that can happen. And I suppose if the function of my bill is just to keep that debate going and to keep it, on the dial and keep it on the schedule and keep it current, that and a lot of those issues could be addressed, on foot of that debate, then, that for me is success. So the passing of the bill itself would obviously be the goal, and I would hope someday that might transpire. But I suppose as I said, there's an awful lot of other things that might come out of just having the debate that the Minister can take action on. And that for me is also, would be a success, because we're coming from such a low base with low expectations that, anything's better than the current situation, to be honest.
Yeah, and I suppose we were kind of chatting earlier, but you could see very quickly sentiment change around this, and committee stage is definitely the big change in opportunity. We had success with private members legislation on fracking back in 2017, I think it was, and it was very funny. We had the same difficulties from the department and ministers as you had mentioned, and as you've had up until now. But as soon as support came around it from across the House, and it got to the committee stage, it was very interesting how quickly the department wanted to work with you. So, have you got that commitment to get it to the committee stage?
Yeah, so to mark Rare Disease Day there at the end of February, a number of colleagues cross-party, we met with stakeholders in industry and patients groups and so on to mark Rare Disease Day. And one of the recommendations that came from our meeting was that we would set up a cross-party committee inside here in the Oireachtas, which is going to be done shortly. And to be fair, the chairman of the health committee is Sean Crowe. He's a Sinn Féin TD here in Dublin, and he gave a commitment that he would do all he could to expedite, the bill coming to committee stage, so it is ready for third stage. And Sean has given the commitment as chair of the health committee that he will do his best to make sure it's prioritised on their schedule. So we're still waiting to get a month or a rough time as to when that might happen. But as I said earlier, the vast majority of people in here are positively disposed to the bill. It might change, it might be amended in time, but there is universal, support for it. So I'm hoping that will help its progression.
You sound to be, somebody who's a little bit frustrated with the progress that has been made. I think we mentioned that you got support from other TDs to sign the petition. Is that frustration shared across the House? Yeah,
to be fair, there's an awful lot of TDs. Look, it's for different reasons. I would have spoken to a few TDs from Cork, West Cork and Kerry in the last couple of months about Zolgensma, and that eventually got ratified. But those TDs, weren't aware of orphan drugs, to be honest, or aren't really familiar with rare diseases. But like anybody, when you're approached by a constituent to raise something in the Dáil, you raise it, and you do your best to highlight an issue. And they did that. Their drug subsequently got approved. Whether it was because of their intervention or not is debatable. But other than that single task that they were tasked with, which was to raise it on behalf of their constituents, they had no interaction or no knowledge of this whole debate. So that's why, again, I reiterate why it's important to have the debate and to get people familiar with it. the funny thing about that drug, and I won't name any of the TDs concerned, but I actually sat beside them during one of the rounds of questions, which you'll be familiar with, which was, promised legislation, where you can literally come in and ask the Taoiseach or the Taoiseach any question. And I turned to one of the TDs and said, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "Oh, this drug Zolgensma." And I said, "Oh, right, yeah, that's interesting." And he said to me, "What are you raising?" And I said, "Oh, orphan drugs as well." And he goes, "What's an orphan drug?" And I just looked at him and said, "You're speaking about orphan drugs and rare diseases right now." And they didn't even realize it themselves. So look, maybe orphan drugs is the worst thing that we label this thing, but I do believe that debate and highlighting it and spotlighting it is pivotal in all this.
Well, I suppose that brings us into a little piece here. We have some of the biggest and best pharma companies in the world, representatives of them on this particular conference call. You're saying there that some TDs weren't aware of the language involved. I'm sure these companies are eager for your ability to succeed, or for your endeavour to succeed. I suppose as the TD who's introducing the legislation, what would your message be to the people who are here listening? And what would your ask be to them in terms of, how can they assist your efforts, and how can they assist the bill to succeed? What would you help them, or what would you ask them to help you to do?
Well, first of all, we've given the commitment that we're going to establish that cross-party committee. So look, any stakeholder in industry or amongst patients, we will be inviting before, that Oireachtas committee once we get it up and running. So obviously participation in that, highlighting the struggles, highlighting the individual cases. It's very hard for me to beg for more clinical trials because, Ireland is not a very attractive place to do an awful lot of this research and to engage in that type of thing. But there is an awful lot you can do in terms of, telling the story, getting the word out there. I think we spoke previously about, the possibility of, engaging further in risk sharing and providing drugs, be it on a trial basis or be it on, and I know that has happened in the past in rare occasions, but I do believe that there's certain things the industry could do, I suppose, to debunk the myth that, industry is there just to make money and not to help patients, because ultimately industry is going to be the one stakeholder that holds the possibility of resolving many of the issues that we're facing. So just think, keep collaborating, keep engaging, and it's probably the best thing, best bit of advice I could give.
Okay, so I'm just going to go to some questions that are in from some of our guests here. The first deputy is from Paula Guerin, who says she really appreciates Deputy O'Sullivan's commitment to the issue of access to orphan meds. If your bill was to pass, what changes on the ground does he expect to see for patients?
Well, ultimately, if it was to pass, I would think that patients would have timely access to drugs. It might only give them some years, months, days, in terms of a return on, their improving health or whatever the case may be. But, that's an awful lot for some people that are facing such, life-threatening and debilitating diseases. So ultimately, I think, just a return for patients in terms of their quality of life is ultimately where I see this improving. On the state's point of view, as I said, this myth about, driving hard bargains, squeezing the life out of each other to get, just through the negotiation process, I don't think things have to be that confrontational. Other countries, and, you can point to Germany, you can point to Sweden, they all actually invest less per capita for these drugs, and their process is far more streamlined and straightforward than ours. So I don't see the need for this adversarial approach. I don't think it's the best for patients, obviously. I don't think it's actually the best for the state, despite what, officials might say in the Department of Health.
Thanks for that. Another one here from an anonymous attendee. Does Deputy O'Sullivan think lessons in improving access to rare medicines can then be applied to all other medicines where we have significant access challenges? So if you're successful in your attempt to break the situation with orphan drugs, is this something then that can be applied to other areas?
Yeah, most definitely. And it just goes back to that point, and I don't want to sound, just waffly about it, but for me, it is about engagement. It's about collaboration. And as I said, I don't see the need for the adversarial approach. And that goes, for on the health issue, that goes for so many other sectors of government and society, whether it's engaging with teaching units. I was at teaching conferences last week, and it's like, a pitched battle every year, and it doesn't need to be. And sometimes engagement and collaboration is far more productive than this pitched battle that we seem to, be so fond of fighting all the time.
Yeah, thanks. I see another one here from an anonymous attendee. How do we get the latest treatments like cell and gene therapies to the patients? And I think that's quite topical, because we've seen this week, I suppose it was an amazing news story about a little girl called Erin, who received CAR T-cell therapy in the UK that saved her life. It was on RT, I think yesterday or maybe the day before. And I suppose it's how do we get these types of medicines into the health services for children? Obviously, your process it's a longer process in terms of changing legislation and changing mindset around the process. But how do we start to get these types of medicines, I suppose, into the system quicker? Is it the same process? Do we have to wait for your process to conclude, or is it something that the department working with industry can help to achieve?
Yeah, no, look, I suppose my bill primarily deals with reimbursement. So, but to answer your question, how do we get drugs? How do we make it more attractive? As I said earlier, and I don't say it, easily, but Ireland is not an attractive place for companies, despite the great record we have in the pharma sphere. Ireland isn't an attractive place for many companies, and they will tell you that themselves firsthand. In terms of conducting clinical trials or whatever the case may be, we just make it very difficult as a state. Thankfully at EU level there is a new pharma strategy being devised, and I know that will do an awful lot in terms of getting drugs towards EMA approval an awful lot quicker. But the difficulty with that strategy is that it doesn't necessarily deal with the issue of reimbursement, and reimbursement will still be a devolved power for the member state, which is what our main issue is. And I'd often comment when I'm on these fora with patients groups and pharma groups, I'd say, I don't understand Ireland is so far behind other countries in terms of approval of drugs. Why do we need to, conduct all this quantitative and often qualitative research? The research is already done, right across the continent. Surely we should just be using the data that's been done, used from other countries, because, like some of the drugs we're talking about have been approved in other member states 2-3 years ago, and surely if they're effective in other states, they'll be effective here.
Absolutely. It's funny, I'm seeing a lot of names that we know here. Owen O'Driscoll, Deputy O'Sullivan, has spoken about the adversarial approach HSE has taken to these negotiations. Does he see any way for this culture to be changed and for focus to be brought by the HSE onto the approach to the process, and put it back more away from the process and put it back onto the patient?
Yeah, I won't say I'd start ignoring HSE officials, but I would definitely start, to make the process more transparent. I'd open it up to scrutiny. I'd let patients, I'd let everybody that wants to see in the public arena, I'd let them see how the process is conducted, and make it far more transparent. Ultimately, obviously pharma companies are private businesses. They are there to make a profit and a dividend for their shareholders. But ultimately, as I said earlier, they're actually part of the solution. They're not the problem. And I would promote engagement. I would promote risk sharing. I like other countries. And it's easy for me to say Germany, and because Germany would have, in compared to us, they would probably have unlimited resources. But there are countries out there like Sweden, that don't employ the same strict quality threshold, bar that we do. And if countries that can do it, I don't see why we can't transpose that kind of model over here. Even Scotland is similar,
Well, yeah, that brings us into another question here from Fred Doherty, who must say I'll quote him, it's a breath of fresh air listening to Deputy O'Sullivan this morning. And patients need a champion like you. So I think that's testament to yourself, Deputy. But his question is, if the bill is passed and the 45 quality removed for OD, do you think that the HSE will then use other references to affordability, budget impact and resource availability to continue the long delays in reimbursement and access? So that would be a fair, obviously, within industry, that the goalpost would be moved somewhat.
Unfortunately, that's always the possibility when you're dealing with the HSE. And I don't say that, you know, as an insult. It's just, you know, they have a job to do, and I understand that they have a difficult job to do, and they need to do what's best for the taxpayer. But I would always maintain that that shouldn't be to the detriment of the patient. I'm not sure if people on the call would have been following a story with Minister Anne Rabbitte over the last few days. It was actually interesting. It kind of gives you a behind the scene look at some of the difficulties that various ministers face in terms of engaging with civil servants. And I found that story in particular, which was carried in the Irish Examiner, I think it illuminates some of the, you know, the arguments and the debates that happen between ministers and their staff and their civil servants. I genuinely think that things would be an awful lot better if there was a collaborative approach. And I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I reiterate it. This pitch battle scenario doesn't need to be the case. And as I said earlier, you can look at models right across the continent. I think Ireland spends about 15% of our entire drugs budget in this space. You know, Germany spends 10.9% and gets far better return for that investment than we do. I think Sweden spends about 12%. You know, again, countries that have a far more open, transparent model than we do, inclusive, often improving drugs, you know, from the start, you know, and getting the reimbursement process done after, and getting patients access to drugs quicker. And us, with this adversarial approach, actually spend more as a percentage of our entire drugs budget on it. It's laughable when we actually think about it.
And just that you mentioned that particular Minister for State, Minister Rabbitte, I would have worked I suppose, very closely with her when working at the Department of Health, and I definitely know the difficulties that she's facing. But a bit like yourself, not afraid to take on the system, and is really trying her best to be successful in that role. And I suppose a bit like yourself, taking the battle internally for better outcome for patients. So I just think that needs to be acknowledged. Next question is from Thorsten, who asked, there is certainly readiness in the pharmaceutical industry for risk sharing, but risk sharing requires continued monitoring of the efficacy of a drug. The current process puts all rigour at the front, and there is no readiness and claimed no resources to change that. Is there readiness in government to take the lead and completely change the current process about how drugs are assessed? And I think we may have assumed that there's not. Deputy.
Sorry, I should have been listening to this since 8 o'clock.
I suppose it's difficult to answer that question because, you know, there's certainly members of government like myself that are very ready to see the process completely scrapped and start afresh. You know, it's a good question, to be fair. Like the minister has told me, in terms of me devising this bill, that he's supportive of it. He wants to see it progress. He wants to see a debate. In time, he might well amend it. But I'm open to that, as I said, because we're starting from such a low base that things can only get better, if you're asking me to be blunt. The Taoiseach himself has said he's supportive of it. He wants to see the process improve. I do believe that there's a political appetite to do something in this arena. What that ultimately looks like, what guise it takes, whether it means that this bill will be progressed or not, I can't say. Only time will tell. But as I said earlier in the conversation, there is a litany of things that the minister could do here, literally at the stroke of a pen, and in consultation with his department, that are non-legislative. You know, like a review of the Rare Disease Technology Review Committee. You know, making things transparent, as I said, letting us see how decisions are made. The quality threshold is mentioned over and over again. Other countries don't operate any quality threshold and spend less on drugs. It's quite obvious that things can be done better no matter what way you approach this.
Moving, I suppose, away from this jurisdiction and into a pan-European space, just for a moment, I see a question coming in here. And it brings me back to a question that we had, we were going to discuss in our own section. I suppose this space is not directly covered by your bill, but it's definitely an area of importance in the overall orphan drugs and reimbursement debate that's ongoing. The European Commission is currently in the process of, I suppose, attempting to overhaul pharmaceutical legislation in the space. And I think it's probably the first time in about 2 decades that they're making their intent known. Discussion at the minute is focusing heavily on, I suppose, IP and its impact on availability. You know, as somebody who's putting forward this bill, who has, you know, big knowledge in the space, what's your views on the EU-wide discussion? And would there be a fair that an attempt to make orphan drugs, more available by reducing the IP rights, is that a concern in terms of the amount of research and development that might have to go into such a product? And would you worry about it in that regard?
I suppose from the outset, I have to say that this bill obviously doesn't deal with, IP issues, but, I suppose they're connected in a way. Look, I think, to be fair, when you see the investment, when you see the trials that we spoke about earlier, when you see all the research that various companies put into, let's be honest about it, drugs that, 2 or 3 people in this country might suffer from. I think there's a balance there that needs to be respected, and a balance needs to be struck in terms of, if companies are making that investment in research, and if they're making that available and putting all those resources into these rare diseases, then I think it's fair in this sphere that we should be very careful that loosening IP rights could be detrimental to actually encouraging further research and further investment into this sphere into the future. So I think there's a delicate balance like anything that needs to be struck, and I think we need to respect the fact that many pharma companies take big risks and make a lot of investment in terms of providing drugs for people that are suffering from rare disease. And I think that balance needs to be respected.
And I suppose if it needs to be respected, and given the employment the industry has in Ireland as a member state, you've mentioned your close connections with Billy Kelleher, you mentioned Francis Fitzgerald. How, as parliamentarians at a national level, and indeed, who've got connected into the European Union, how do we go about trying to protect that particular element?
Again, it's quite difficult because there, like anything, there's always a rush. And I know, look, we had a perfect example of it through the pandemic. We're still talking about IP rights in terms of vaccine distribution. And there's a debate to be had there. To be fair, that's the pandemic, and it's something that affected us all. But like in Ireland, we have tens of thousands of jobs tied up in this sphere. And like I was only at BioMarin's 10th-year anniversary in Shanbally on Monday. I grew up in Little Island, as I said, where we've over the years we've had Johnson & Johnson, we've had Pfizer's, we've had a whole host of pharma companies in my own environment. I see that thousands of jobs dependent on it. But as I said, look, wider availability of drugs is a good thing, but not if it upsets the balance in terms of making it attractive for companies to continue to invest and innovate in that sector. So look, it's a delicate balance. It's difficult. I'm not going to pretend it's easy, but I think we need to respect the fact that, as I said earlier, industry is the solution to all our problems in this sphere, and we need to respect, their, I suppose, investment and their commitment. So it's a delicate.
Yeah, absolutely. I know you speak about corporate, but I definitely know, even here in my own county in Sligo, the value of these companies is just, without them we wouldn't be the country we are. And I think that needs to be, I suppose, remembered by all our national politicians in this particular debate. Look, I suppose we're coming into the last 5 minutes. I want to move us away from the legislative space, and I suppose finish off with a couple of closed questions and bring us back down to a more friendly space, as opposed to talk about legislation. So I suppose, outside of your own political party, can I ask you the question, which politician would you rate the highest? Which opposition politician would you rate the highest in the current Dáil?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one. I think I would give the answer. Look, I don't agree with him all the time. I don't agree with his party on many occasions, but I do believe that Pierce Doherty is quite a formidable force, So I think that, look, rightly or wrongly, and as I said, we disagree on many things. I think he firmly believes in what he's doing, and there's a commitment there, and I'd respect him for that, begrudgingly, but I would.
Yeah, and I think that's sentiment that's shared across the House. He's quite a formidable politician. In a one-word answer, can you tell us all what your favourite book is, what your favourite film is, and what's your favourite holiday destination?
Holiday destination, start from the back. Ballyferter, I go there every year with my young family, and even prior to that, I just go there. I was an Irish and history teacher, so it's my kind of connection to the Gaeltacht that I've built over the years. And we like to rent a house down there, and we get to go away for a week in the summer. Movie, I'd probably look at something like Braveheart, some other kind of historical epic.
Not Michael Collins, no.
Not that version of it, no. And book, look, it'd probably be some boring historical or political books. So I could pick a dozen titles, but
Yeah.
So
in terms of if you had to be from any other county bar County Cork, which county would you be from and why?
Well, all my mother's side are from Tip, so it might be a hurling rivalry, but Tip, yeah, I've got some good friends and family there. So why?
Why? Yeah.
Yeah, that might be a tricky part. No, just lovely county, lovely people, as I said, and lots of family there.
If the Taoiseach came to you in December and said, Pádraig, I'm going to give you the keys of any political office in government, what office would you choose and why?
Yeah, I probably should say health, given that we're on this call, but unfortunately I'm a teacher, so it would be education, and I'd have dozens of ideas that I'd like to think that I could try and implement and changes. We're going through leaving cert reform, just for example, reforming the SUSI grant process for students. I suppose it does help, in this sphere in terms of, getting greater investment into third level as well, despite that being a separate department now, but there's major reforms coming in education. I'd love to be part of that.
And I suppose the final question and the last question of this political series, we've heard earlier about your wonderful family, your life at home in Cork, and I suppose we're going into a long weekend now, something to look forward to. What's your plans for the long weekend? Will you get a chance to switch off, or will it be work?
Well, ordinarily, I think it's feeding child 1, changing child 2's nappy, changing child 3's clothes. But hopefully, they love going to the beach, so that's kind of our little treat. If the weather's good, we go down to the beach and we take all the diggers and the shovels and we just mess for a few hours, normally an inch in East Cork, just beyond Middleton. So hopefully we'll get to go for a day to the beach. So that's about as good as it's going to get. I have 20 clinics, I think, on Friday and Saturday as well. So it'll have to be after that.
Oh man, that's never changes. Look, that sounds good. I really hope you get a chance to switch off and take it all in and enjoy the beach. Fingers crossed the weather a little bit better. But I suppose with that, Pádraig, that's going to bring us to an end to this particular series this morning. I suppose kind of thank you for your time and most importantly for your honesty today. I think it was very helpful for our guests, who I'm sure would have found it very interesting to find out a little bit more about yourself, but also about the ambition behind the bill and the potential for success behind it. I think they might have been happy to hear your views on how they can continue to support this legislation, either directly or indirectly. And I really think it was beneficial in that sense. So on behalf of all the guests online and of all the IPHA organisers of today's event, can I wish you the very best of luck in your endeavours. They're very courageous. You're doing this state a good service, and we really hope that you can make the impact in the space that you're seeking to make. So finally then, can I just thank all the guests for tuning in this morning. I hope you all enjoyed it. I definitely did. And can I suppose, welcome, or can I say, wish you a wonderful day, and a very good long weekend. And I think that is us closing it now. So bye for now.
Thank you very much, Blaine. Thank you, Deputy O'Sullivan. It was really excellent. And we look forward to the next occasion as well. And well done, everybody. Thank you, and over and out.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye.